At the southern tip of Europe, a great limestone promontory rises above the sea. Today it is called Gibraltar. 24,000 years ago, it was already an ancient landmark shaped by deep geological time. Its sheer cliffs and hidden caves faced the Mediterranean on one side and the Atlantic winds on the other. Far away to the south lay the mountains of North Africa, their outlines closer than they are today, because the sea between was narrower. This narrow corridor of land and water, connecting and dividing continents, framed one of the last chapters of Neanderthal life. Neanderthals had once ranged widely across Europe and Western Asia. For more than 200,000 years, they endured shifting climates, hunted large animals, and crafted simple but effective stone tools. Yet by the time glaciers spread across the northern world, their range had contracted. Populations that had thrived in forests and valleys gradually disappeared. Only a few regions remained where small groups could persist. Gibraltar was one of those refugees. The rock itself offered protection. Its caves opened toward the sea, sheltered from cold winds and inland extremes. In the entrance of Gorham's Cave, firelight once flickered on damp stone walls. Ash and charcoal still remain in the sediments, traces of repeated visits by families over many generations. They gathered here not as conquerors of the land, but as survivors at its margin. The environment around the rock was different from the icy north. Even during glacial periods, this corner of Europe stayed relatively mild. Warm currents of the Mediterranean tempered the air. Coastal waters provided steady resources, shellfish clinging to rocks, fish darting in shallow pools, seabirds nesting on cliffs. Inland, red deer and wild goats grazed in scrubby hills. Though forests had retreated, there was still enough variety to support life. Archaeologists find stone tools scattered on these cave floors. They are mostly simple flakes, struck from cores of flint or quartzite. Some were retouched into scrapers used to clean hides or prepare wood. They resemble tools made by Neanderthals across Europe for tens of millennia. The persistence of these forms suggests a continuity of tradition, even as their world contracted. To hold such a tool is to glimpse a rhythm of life unchanged in its essentials, even while the climate shifted and new human groups spread elsewhere. What makes Gibraltar remarkable is the lateness of these traces. In many other parts of Europe, Neanderthals vanish from the record around 40,000 years ago. Their disappearance often coincides with the arrival of Homo sapiens, who brought new toolkits, symbolic art, and wide social networks. Yet here, on the edge of Europe, evidence suggests that Neanderthals held on for another 16,000 years. This extraordinary survival is one of the central mysteries of their story. Why here? Some researchers argue that Gibraltar's geography created a natural refuge. The rock's cliffs provided security, the sea offered abundant food, and the mild climate spared them the harshest conditions of the Ice Age. Others caution that the evidence may be sparse, and that dating methods always leave room for debate. Still, the sediments of Gorham's Cave and nearby shelters carry layers of occupation, fire remains, and food waste that appear to extend well beyond the timeline of other sites. A lesser-known detail deepens this picture. In Gorham's Cave, archaeologists discovered markings carved into the bedrock floor. The lines form a cross-hatched pattern, perhaps made deliberately with a stone tool. These incisions may be one of the few surviving examples of Neanderthal symbolic expression. If so, they reveal that the last groups at Gibraltar carried with them not only physical traditions of tool use and subsistence, but also the capacity for abstract thought. Whether these marks were ritual, message, or idle scratching. No one can be certain, but they linger as quiet testimony beneath the sediment. On a planetary scale, Gibraltar at this time was shaped by the glacial cycle. Vast ice sheets in the north locked away immense volumes of water. Sea levels fell by more than 100 meters compared to today. This exposed wide coastal plains, altering ecosystems and animal migrations. It also meant that the strait between Africa and Europe was narrower, the distance across the water reduced. Though no evidence confirms direct crossing by Neanderthals here, the proximity invites speculation. Did they look south across the waves, sensing another land? Or was the sea itself a barrier they never overcame? The mystery of Gibraltar is bound to these questions. Were these truly the last Neanderthal, isolated at the edge of continents, or do undiscovered traces still wait elsewhere? The sediments preserve moments, but not whole lives. We see fragments, a hearth, a shell, a carved mark. From them, we infer patterns of survival. Yet the silence between artifacts is vast. How many individuals walked these shores, how they organized their days, whether they encountered Homo sapiens in this region, all remain uncertain. Still, the endurance itself is striking. In a time when their kin had vanished from most of Eurasia, a small band found ways to persist. Their presence on this limestone rock reminds us that survival is not always about expansion or triumph. Sometimes it is about holding on, season after season, in a place that still yields enough. The caves of Gibraltar, with their soot and stone, bear witness to that final chapter of resilience. Far away, the glaciers continued to grow, reshaping the world's climate. Rivers carved new courses, coastlines shifted outward, and winds swept dry plains across the continents. Yet here, at the edge of Europe, the last known Neanderthals lit their fires, gathered their shellfish, and watched the waves crash against the ancient cliffs. Their story was nearing its end, but in these shadows of stone and sea, it lingered longer than almost anywhere else on Earth. By 40,000 years ago, most Neanderthal communities across Europe had already vanished. Their camps and hearths fell silent in the river valleys of France, in the wooded hills of Central Europe, and in the cold plains stretching eastward toward Siberia. Archaeological sequences reveal a stark pattern. Layers rich in tools, bones, and charcoal suddenly give way to emptiness, replaced only by traces of other human groups. The continent that had been Neanderthal homeland for more than 200,000 years was steadily losing them. Their decline was not a single event, but a drawn-out process that unfolded region by region. Several factors seem to have converged. Climate change was among the most important. During the later Ice Age, the climate oscillated sharply between colder and milder intervals. Glaciers advanced and retreated, and ecosystems shifted with surprising speed. Wooded regions became open grasslands, then reverted again. For Neanderthals, who relied heavily on medium-sized game in forested habitats, red deer, wild boar, and similar prey, these shifts caused profound challenges. Their hunting strategies, often involving close encounters with animals at short range, became less effective on open tundra, where herds moved widely and unpredictably. At the same time, Homo sapiens entered Europe. Modern humans carried with them technologies that allowed more flexible adaptation. Blade-based stone tools, projectile points, bone needles, and symbolic ornaments suggest larger social networks and broader diets. Archaeological evidence indicates that modern humans consumed not only large animals, but also smaller prey, fish, and plant foods. This flexibility may have given them a survival advantage as climates shifted. Neanderthals, though capable and intelligent, may have found themselves competing at a disadvantage. Yet extinction did not sweep across the continent in a single wave. Instead, Neanderthals retreated into ecological refuges where conditions remained favorable. Southern Europe became especially important. Along the Mediterranean coast, winters were less harsh, vegetation more diverse, and food sources more reliable. In Italy, the Balkans, and Iberia, late Neanderthal sites indicate that scattered populations endured while their northern relatives disappeared. These refuges functioned like islands of persistence in an ocean of loss. The Iberian Peninsula provides one of the clearest examples. Surrounded by sea on three sides and blocked to the north by the Pyrenees, it became a cul-de-sac where Neanderthal groups lingered for thousands of years beyond their disappearance elsewhere. Caves in southern Spain and Portugal preserve Mousterian tools, simple flake industries associated with Neanderthals that date to around 35,000 years ago. These occupations show that the peninsula acted as a final redoubt, delaying but not preventing the eventual end. A lesser-known discovery comes from Portuguese coastal caves, where evidence suggests that Neanderthals collected marine resources. Shell middens contain limpets, mussels, and other shellfish. Cut marks on bones indicate processing of fish and marine mammals. For decades, scholars assumed that systematic exploitation of the sea was unique to modern humans. These findings challenge that view, showing that Neanderthals, too, could turn to the shoreline in times of need. Their survival strategies were more varied than once believed. Nevertheless, their range kept shrinking. Genetic studies reinforce the picture of a dwindling population. Ancient DNA indicates that by this stage, all surviving Neanderthals across Eurasia may have numbered only a few thousand individuals. Such low numbers create a fragile demographic situation. Isolated groups are vulnerable to disease, inbreeding, and loss of cultural knowledge. A band of only dozens may preserve stone-flaking traditions, but if skilled knappers die without passing on their craft, techniques may vanish in a single generation. Population collapse can accelerate through such spirals. On the planetary scale, this was also a time of dramatic climatic instability. Ice cores from Greenland reveal rapid fluctuations known as Dansgaard-Oeschger events, in which average temperatures could rise or fall several degrees within mere centuries. These oscillations reshaped rainfall patterns and vegetation across Europe. Rivers shifted course, grasslands expanded and contracted, and animal populations migrated accordingly. For small Neanderthal groups already under pressure, such instability was a severe challenge. Each sudden change meant relearning landscapes, readapting to prey distributions, and reorganizing seasonal movements. The mystery of contact with Homo sapiens deepens this story. Did encounters between the two species hasten Neanderthal decline? In some region, their traces overlap closely in time. In caves of France, layers associated with modern humans often lie directly above those of Neanderthals, separated by little more than a thin band of sediment. Yet the nature of interaction remains uncertain. Some genetic evidence demonstrates interbreeding, but archaeological signs of conflict or cooperation are scarce. Did Neanderthals and sapiens compete directly for the same resources? Did they avoid one another, separated by geography and chance? The answers remain elusive. What is clear is that by 35 to 30,000 years ago, Neanderthal populations had shrunk to a few enclaves. The soundscape of Europe was changing, where once the rhythm of flint knapping, the crackle of hearths, and the voices of Neanderthal hunters echoed across valleys. Silence now grew. The continent was slowly losing its long-standing inhabitants. Small groups persisted in refuges, but their days were numbered. In this long twilight, Gibraltar stands apart. While most of Europe saw the disappearance of Neanderthals well before 30,000 years ago, the limestone caves at Europe's southern edge continued to record their presence. Sediments at Gorham's and Vanguard caves preserve hearths, tools, and shells that appear to date as late as 24,000 years ago. If these dates hold true, Gibraltar became not only a geographical frontier, but a temporal one, the place where the Neanderthal story lingered longest. Thus, the waning of Neanderthals was not uniform, but patchy, drawn out, and shaped by local landscapes. Some groups may have faded quickly, others endured for millennia. Climate, competition, isolation, and chance all played roles. Across Europe, their presence contracted like shadows receding at dusk, leaving only a few pools of light before darkness fell. The story of Gibraltar belongs to this final phase, when one of the last fragments of an ancient lineage endured against time at the edge of land and sea. 24,000 years ago, Earth was deep within the grip of the last glacial maximum. Vast ice sheets spread across the northern hemisphere, covering millions of square kilometers. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet pressed down into the heart of the continent, while in northern Europe, the Fennoscandian ice sheet buried mountains and valleys alike. These massive accumulations of frozen water altered not only landscapes, but also the balance of the planet itself. Their weight deformed the crust. Their gleaming expanses reflected sunlight back into space, and their cold air systems shaped winds that reached across the globe. One of the most direct consequences of so much water being locked up in ice was the lowering of global sea levels. When glaciers expanded, the oceans withdrew. During the height of this glacial age, sea levels were more than 100 meters below what we know today. Vast coastal plains were exposed, creating landscapes unfamiliar to us now. The North Sea basin, which is presently filled with shallow waters, was then a broad expanse of lowland known to modern researchers as Doggerland. In Southeast Asia, the shallow seas between islands receded, merging land masses into the vast continent of Sunderland. Across the globe, coastlines stretched outward and reshaped the habitats of countless species. At Gibraltar, the sea told the same story. The strait between Europe and Africa, which today narrows to 14 kilometers at its tightest point, was considerably shorter in the Ice Age world. Rocky shoals, sandy banks, and emergent islands may have dotted the crossing, reducing the distance of open water. From the high vantage of the rock, the mountains of northern Morocco would have appeared closer, their outlines sharper against the horizon. For those living in the caves along the base of Gibraltar, the sight of another continent was a daily reality, a silent presence across the narrow sea. For Neanderthals, this narrowing of the strait was both an opportunity and a limit. On one hand, the changing shorelines provided new resources. Beaches expanded, tidal pools teemed with shellfish, and exposed reefs offered easy harvests of limpets and mussels. Archaeological evidence from Gorham's cave confirms that Neanderthals made use of these resources, leaving behind shells cracked open for their meat. On the other hand, the the sea remained a boundary. Even at its narrowest, it posed a formidable challenge to crossing. Currents coursed strongly through the strait, funneling Atlantic and Mediterranean waters. No evidence of Neanderthal seafaring has been found, and scholars doubt that they ever attempted to cross. Thus, Africa remained visible but unreachable, an ever-present reminder of another world just beyond their grasp. Inland, the climate of Iberia contrasted with the frozen expanses of northern Europe. While glaciers advanced over Scandinavia and the Alps, the southern peninsula remained free of permanent ice. Its climate was harsh, yet more moderate than the far north. Vegetation responded in shifting mosaics. Pollen cores extracted from nearby sediments tell the story. Layers dominated by pine alternate with traces of oak and juniper, showing cycles of woodland retreat and return. Grasslands and scrub spread widely, feeding herds of ibex, red deer, and wild horses. In the lower valleys, rabbits multiplied, creating a reliable if modest source of food. For Neanderthals, this ecological diversity mattered deeply. It allowed them to vary their diet and adjust their foraging strategies as conditions shifted. The caves of Gibraltar were more than mere shelters. They were products of long geological processes, carved first by waves during ancient high seas, then stranded above the water as levels fell. They became natural sanctuaries. Vanguard and Gorham's caves opened directly toward the shore, offering protection from wind and rain while giving immediate access to the beach. Generations of Neanderthals used these spaces, their fires leaving dark stains on the stone. Each hearth, each scatter of bones and flint, was embedded in a setting shaped by the interplay of rock and sea. On the planetary scale, the last glacial maximum tied distant regions together. Dust lifted from glacial plains and deserts traveled vast distances on high winds, settling as low China or fertilizing ocean waters with minerals. Changes in ocean circulation, triggered by cooling in the North Atlantic, influenced rainfall patterns as far away as the tropics. In Africa, these shifts determined whether the Sahara would pulse with rivers and lakes or expand as arid desert. Thus, the survival of Neanderthals at Gibraltar was not isolated. It was part of a global system of ice, water, and wind. A lesser-known clue to their world lies in the sediments of Gorham's cave, where archaeologists uncovered charcoal fragments from repeated fires. Chemical analysis suggests that wood from different species was burned, including pine and juniper. This shows that Neanderthals gathered fuel from the shifting mosaic of vegetation, adapting to what the landscape offered. Even in glacial times, they maintained knowledge of plants, wood, and fire. The fires not only cooked shellfish and roasted meat, but also warmed the cave against cold winds and extended the use of the space into the dark hours of night. Mysteries remain about whether the strait was ever crossed. Some researchers note that even without deliberate voyages, natural events could have carried humans across. A floating log, a storm-driven raft of vegetation, or even determined swimmers might, in rare cases, have reached the opposite shore. Could stray individuals have crossed by chance? If so, they would have linked populations on both continents. But in the absence of direct evidence, the question remains open. For now, the archaeological record suggests that Gibraltar's Neanderthals remained bound to their side of the sea. From their vantage, the world appeared both vast and close. To the north lay the dry hills of Iberia, dotted with game. To the south, the African mountains shimmered across the water. Above, the sky carried migrating birds, vultures, eagles, and swallows, crossing the strait with ease. For Neanderthals on the ground, movement was more constrained. Their world was defined by what they could walk, climb, and gather. The narrow sea reminded them daily of a distance uncrossed. Yet within these boundaries, they endured. The lowered seas, the exposed shores, and the mild refuge of the peninsula combined to give them a chance to persist while their kin vanished elsewhere. The glaciers dictated the larger rhythm of Earth, but Gibraltar carved out a small space of stability. Their fires burned in caves perched above the waves, while across the globe ice sheets advanced. In this interplay between glaciers and the sea, Neanderthals found their last sanctuary. At the base of the towering limestone promontory, where the sea breaks into spray against narrow ledges, the entrances of dark caves open into the stone. These natural hollows, carved over ages by waves and uplift, became the living places of the last known Neanderthals. When they sought refuge here, the world outside was dominated by ice and shifting climates. Yet within these shelters they found continuity and protection. The caves of Gibraltar, Gorham's, Vanguard, Bennett's, and others stand today as silent archives of their lives. Gorham's cave is the best known among them. Its entrance faces east, allowing morning light to stream in. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were over 100 meters lower, the shoreline extended far beyond the cliffs of today. Where the sea now touches the base of the rock, there was once a broad plain of dunes, beaches, and tidal flats. Neanderthals, standing at the cave mouth, would have looked across this open land toward the horizon, where the waters of the Mediterranean glittered. The cave itself was large and dry, its chambers stretching back into the cliff, with walls that kept a steady temperature throughout the year. Archaeologists who excavated Gorham's sediments found hearth after hearth layered within. Ashes and charcoal accumulated over centuries, pressed by footsteps, then covered by sand, only to be replaced by new fires. Charcoal analysis reveals that Neanderthals burned pine, juniper, and oak, drawing fuel from the mosaic of vegetation that surrounded the rock. These fires cooked shellfish, roasted meat, and warmed the dark spaces. They also illuminated the stone wall, turning the cave into a gathering place when daylight faded. The stone tools left behind are familiar. Simple flakes, struck from flint nodules or quartzite cobbles, dominate the assemblages, retouched scrapers, notched tools, and a few points reveal repeated tasks: scraping hides, cutting meat, working wood. Their technology belongs to the Mousterian tradition, a style maintained across Europe for tens of thousands of years. Here, at Gibraltar, it endured almost unchanged until the very end. Even as modern humans elsewhere used blades, bone needles, and ornaments, the Neanderthals of these shelters relied on the techniques of their ancestors. Continuity, not innovation, defined their toolkit. Animal bones speak of diet and adaptation. Red deer and ibex provided meat and hides. Rabbits, abundant in Iberia, added small but steady contributions. Bird bones show that Neanderthals caught pigeons and other cliff-nesting species, likely by hand or with simple traps. Seal bones, found in some layers, suggest opportunistic hunting along the shore. Cut marks on many of these remains show butchery with stone edges, while burned fragments confirm cooking at hearths. Unlike the great hunts of the north, where mammoth and bison dominated, life in Gibraltar depended on a wide spectrum of smaller, varied resources. One of the most intriguing discoveries lies carved into the bedrock of Gorham's cave. A cross-hatched engraving, intersecting lines deliberately incised into the stone, was revealed beneath later sediments. Its meaning is unknown. Some see it as a sign of symbolic thought, a deliberate mark not tied to practical tasks. Others argue it may have been idle scratching or incidental. Whatever its purpose, it is among the few pieces of evidence hinting that Neanderthals engaged in abstract expression. Within these shelters, life was not only survival, it also left space, however briefly, for mark-making. Other caves around the rock expand the picture. Vanguard Cave, with its deep chambers, preserves layers rich in bones of birds, fish, and mammals, alongside evidence of repeated hearths. Bennett's Cave, smaller and more secluded, contains sediments with preserved pollen, offering a record of vegetation changes outside. Together, these caves form a network of refugees used across generations. Some may have been seasonal camp, others longer-term dwellings. Each contributed pieces of the larger story of Neanderthal persistence at Gibraltar. On a planetary scale, these caves remind us of the intersection between geology and human survival. They were shaped millions of years earlier by sea action when the Mediterranean was higher. As glaciers lowered sea levels, the caves rose above the tide and became available for habitation. In this sense, Neanderthal life at Gibraltar was part of a rhythm extending far beyond human timescales, the breathing of oceans, the shifting of stone, the cycles of ice. Their survival here was possible only because geology created spaces precisely suited for refuge. Mysteries remain about how these caves were used. Did groups stay through entire years, or did they return seasonally, moving inland at times? The mixture of animal species in bone assemblages suggests both coastal and upland foraging. Hearths appear in multiple layers, but with gaps that may indicate intermittent use. Some archaeologists suggest that Neanderthals moved in small circuits along the southern Iberian coast, with Gibraltar as one stop among several. Others argue the caves could have been more permanent bases. The evidence allows for both, and certainty is elusive. Yet certain impressions are clear. Life in the rock shelters revolved around fire, food, and tools. A hearth glowing at night. Hides stretched near the entrance. Stone flakes scattered across the floor. These were the patterns of daily existence. From the cave mouth, individuals could watch the tides, birds, and distant hills, while inside the walls reflected the crackle of fire and the steady rhythm of tasks. Each layer of sediment, each burned fragment of bone, records these rhythms across centuries. A lesser-known detail underscores their resilience. In one level of Vanguard Cave, archaeologists discovered remains of monk seal pups, suggesting hunting during breeding seasons. This implies knowledge of animal behavior and timing, an ability to track and exploit predictable patterns. Such skill reveals sophisticated observation of the environment. It also hints at the seasonal cycles that structured life within these shelters, linking firelight in the cave to the wider movements of animals beyond. For the Neanderthals who lived here, the shelters offered more than protection. They were vantage points, storehouses, and anchors in a shifting world. The caves provided constancy when the climate oscillated between cold and less cold, when coastlines advanced and retreated, when northern populations disappeared. Within these stone chambers, survival was extended. Each hearth represented not just warmth, but persistence against the long decline of their lineage. Today, the caves still stand, though their entrances are closer to the modern shoreline. Archaeologists sift through their sediments grain by grain, uncovering what was left behind. Ash becomes a record of fire, bone a memory of meals, engraved lines a whisper of thought. These shelters, once filled with voices and smoke, are silent now, their walls echoing only with waves and seabirds. Yet within them lies the story of endurance, of life carved into stone at the edge of the Ice Age world. Along the rocky shores beneath Gibraltar's cliffs, the tide withdrew each day to reveal a living carpet of marine life. Limpets clung tightly to wet stone, mussels formed dense clusters in crevices, and crabs scuttled across pools filled with seawater. For the Neanderthals who lived in the caves above, these intertidal zones offered a reliable larder. At a time when inland forests were shrinking and large game was less predictable, the sea provided food that could be gathered with little more than careful hands and sharp eyes. Archaeological excavations in Gorham's and Vanguard caves confirm this reliance. Layers of shell debris lie thick in the sediments, with fragments of limpets, mussels, and clams scattered among ash and stone flakes. Some shells show signs of heating, suggesting they were roasted directly on embers. Others appear cracked by deliberate force. These accumulations are not random. They testify to systematic harvesting of marine resources, carried out repeatedly over centuries. For the last Neanderthals of Gibraltar, the sea was not just a boundary but a daily provider. Birds were another important part of this coastal diet. The cliffs of Gibraltar were, and still are, home to thousands of nesting seabirds, pigeons, gulls, cormorants, and migratory species. Bones of birds, some with cut marks, have been recovered from the caves. These indicate butchering and consumption. The hunting of birds was once thought unlikely for Neanderthals, who were often portrayed as hunters of large mammals alone. Yet the evidence here shows otherwise. Cliff-nesting birds could be caught by hand during the nesting season or trapped with simple means. Their eggs, too, would have provided valuable nutrition. This diversification of diet is one of the features that may have allowed Gibraltar's Neanderthals to endure longer than others. Instead of relying heavily on large terrestrial animals, they exploited smaller, more reliable resources close to home. Shellfish beds renewed themselves continually. Birds returned each season to breed, and rabbits multiplied in abundance across the peninsula. Each of these sources required less risk and less energy than stalking red deer in distant valleys. For small groups living on the margins of survival, such reliability was crucial. On a planetary scale, this adaptation reflects the broader changes brought by the Ice Age. As sea levels fell, new coastlines emerged, exposing tidal flats and rocky shelves rich in marine life. What had once been deep water became shallow pools and beaches, creating habitats full of accessible food. Neanderthals, though often imagined as creatures of forests and mountains, clearly recognized the opportunities of these changing shores. Their use of marine resources places them within a global pattern of adaptation to shifting landscapes. A lesser-known detail comes from isotopic studies of Neanderthal bones. While most Neanderthal remains across Europe show diets dominated by terrestrial meat, some from coastal Iberia reveal traces of marine proteins. This suggests that the Gibraltar groups were unique in making significant use of the sea. They may have been among the very few Neanderthal populations to integrate marine foods into their regular diet. If so, this represents a localized adaptation that distinguishes them from their kin farther north and east. Mystery still surrounds how systematic this practice was. Did they gather shellfish daily, or only during lean times? Were bird hunts opportunistic, or organized as seasonal events? The archaeological record offers fragments but not answers. Piles of shells may represent repeated short visits, or they may reflect intensive gathering during certain periods of scarcity. Bird bones may record opportunism, or they may indicate a more structured strategy tied to nesting cycles. Without direct observation, the pattern remains debated. What is clear is that these resources were available in abundance. The Mediterranean tides exposed shellfish twice a day. Migratory birds filled the skies seasonally, resting on cliffs before long journeys across the sea. Even in glacial climates, these rhythms continued. For Neanderthals, attunement to these cycles would have been vital. Knowledge passed between generations: when to collect limpets, where to find nesting ledges, how to avoid the dangers of slippery rocks or aggressive gulls. Such knowledge transformed the coastal landscape into a dependable storehouse. From the perspective of survival, the exploitation of shellfish and birds reveals something profound. It shows that Neanderthals were capable of broad ecological awareness, not merely tied to one form of hunting. They recognized the potential of coastlines, just as they understood forests, grasslands, and mountains. This flexibility, though perhaps limited in scale, reflects the same kind of observational skill that later allowed Homo sapiens to expand across the globe. It suggests that the difference between the two species was not absolute but relative, variations of degree rather than kind. The caves themselves preserve direct evidence of preparation. Burned shells suggest cooking methods, roasting on coals, perhaps steaming in damp leaves, or simply cracking open raw. Bird bones, singed and fractured, imply roasting of small bodies whole. These practices left behind layers of debris, now sifted carefully by archaeologists. Each fragment of shell or bone is a data point, a whisper of meals consumed beside firelight in the shadow of stone walls. On a global canvas, such behavior links Gibraltar's Neanderthals to broader questions of human evolution. The use of coastal resources has long been associated with modern humans in Africa, where shell middens dating back more than 100,000 years reveal similar practices. That Neanderthals also exploited the sea complicates the narrative of uniqueness. It suggests convergent solutions to the challenges of survival. Perhaps coastal living was an option available to all humans, given the right circumstances. Still, uncertainties linger. Did these practices contribute to their extended survival, or were they signs of desperation? Strategies adopted in the final struggle to persist? The answer remains uncertain. What is certain is that, in the last refuges of their existence, Neanderthals of Gibraltar gathered shellfish and birds, turning to the sea and sky as well as the land. Their choices are recorded not in words, but in shells cracked by fire, bones marked by flint, and layers of ash where meals were shared. Step by step, tide by tide, they wove coastal resources into their lives, from cliff to cave, from pool to fire. The rhythm of gathering sustained them. The rock of Gibraltar, looming above, bore witness as they moved between stone shelter and seashore. In this interplay of land and water, they prolonged their existence in a world that was otherwise closing in. In the dim light of Gibraltar's caves, scattered among ash and sand, lie the remains of Neanderthal craftsmanship. Flakes of flint, worn scrapers, and fractured cores speak to a tradition that stretched back hundreds of thousands of years. These tools were not elaborate. They were not meant to impress. They were functional, practical, and reliable, passed down through generations with little change. In the last redoubt of Neanderthal life, the making of stone tools remained a constant rhythm, as essential as fire itself. The predominant toolkit of Neanderthals is known as the Mousterian industry. It is characterized by flake tools struck from prepared cores. A napper would select a nodule of flint or quartzite, then shape it carefully, detaching flakes with precise blows. Some flakes were retouched to sharpen edges or create scrapers. Others were left as simple cutting tools. Archaeologists recognize these forms across Europe, from France to Russia. At Gibraltar, they appear in the cave sediments as a continuation of that long tradition. Even as the world around them shifted, the Neanderthals of Gibraltar used the same methods as their distant kin had for millennia. The simplicity of these tools does not diminish their effectiveness. A sharp flake can slice through hide or cut meat cleanly. A scraper can prepare animal skins for clothing or bedding. A notched tool can smooth wooden shafts. In combination with fire, these implements enabled Neanderthals to shape their environment and extend their survival. Together, stone and fire formed the foundation of their daily existence. Archaeologists analyzing the Gorham's cave assemblages have noted the continuity of these traditions. Unlike modern humans of the same period, who employed blades, bone tools, and ornaments, the Gibraltar Neanderthals held to their Mousterian repertoire. This may have been due to isolation, small population size, or simple sufficiency. Their tools were adequate for their needs. Yet this conservatism may also reflect vulnerability. Innovations that spread quickly among larger Homo sapiens groups did not reach or take hold in these final Neanderthal communities. Evidence of tool use is complemented by traces of fire. Hearths appear throughout the cave layers. Charcoal and burned bones testify to repeated use of fire for cooking, warmth, and light. The ability to control fire was one of the great achievements of humanity, shared by Neanderthals and sapiens alike. In Gibraltar, fire transformed the caves into habitable spaces. It kept dampness at bay, illuminated dark chambers, and provided a focal point for social life. Without fire, the rock shelters would have been cold, unwelcoming hollows. With fire, they became homes. On a planetary scale, the mastery of fire marks a turning point in human history. By controlling flame, hominins expanded into colder climates, extended their waking hours, and unlocked new sources of food. Cooking increased the nutritional value of plants and meat alike, reducing disease risks and digestion times. Fire also shaped landscapes, as humans used it to clear vegetation and manage animal movements. For Neanderthals at Gibraltar, fire linked them to a lineage of control stretching far back into the deep past. Their glowing hearths were part of a global human story of flame. A lesser-known detail adds texture to this record. In some layers of Gorham's cave, archaeologists found manganese dioxide blocks, black mineral lumps that appear to have been deliberately collected. Chemical analysis suggests these were ground into powder and sprinkled on wood to lower its ignition temperature. If true, this indicates that Neanderthals had knowledge of fire chemistry, using minerals to aid in combustion. Such behavior, though subtle, reveals a sophistication often underestimated. It shows that their mastery of fire extended beyond simple use to an understanding of how to manipulate and enhance it. Mysteries remain about the extent of Neanderthal tool diversity. In some Iberian sites, late Neanderthals show occasional use of blade-like tools or ornaments, perhaps influenced by contact with Homo sapiens. At Gibraltar, however, such items are absent. Were the Gibraltar groups too isolated to adopt new forms, or did they consciously maintain older traditions? Did the small scale of their population limit experimentation, making conservatism the safer path? Archaeology cannot yet answer. What is evident is that in their last refuge, Neanderthals carried forward a toolkit rooted in continuity rather than novelty. The daily rhythm of tool and fire can be imagined through the evidence left behind. In the morning, someone might walk the shore, collecting flint nodules washed in from riverbeds. Back at the cave, a core was struck, flakes detached, sparks flying with each blow. Scrapers were prepared to clean the hides of red deer or ibex brought back from hunts. At the hearth, firewood gathered from juniper scrub was fed into glowing embers, flames leaping as shellfish roasted on stones. Smoke curled upward to darken the cave ceiling. The stone floor was scattered with flakes, bones, and ash, a record of labor and sustenance. On a wider scale, the persistence of Mousterian tools shows the resilience of cultural traditions. Knowledge of how to strike flint was not innate, it was taught and learned. Each new generation acquired the skill from elders, passing it on in turn. Even in dwindling groups, this transmission endured. The tools in Gibraltar's caves are evidence of memory and teaching, of cultural continuity carried through time. They connect the last Neanderthals to ancestors who lived far away, long before in valleys and plains across Eurasia. At the same time, the conservatism of their toolkit contrasts with the rapid spread of new forms among Homo sapiens. This contrast highlights one of the enduring mysteries of human evolution. Why did modern humans innovate and diversify, while Neanderthals remained steady? Was it a matter of population size, communication networks, or cognitive difference? The answer remains unresolved. What is clear is that, as sapiens painted images on cave walls and adorned themselves with beads, the Neanderthals of Gibraltar continued to rely on flakes and hearths. Yet in that reliance lies a story of survival. Their tools and fires were sufficient to sustain them in their rocky refuge, to feed them with shellfish and deer, to warm them against glacial winds. The conservatism that may have limited their expansion also allowed them to persist when all else narrowed. In the glow of their hearths, stone and fire remained the anchors of existence. Thus, life in Gibraltar's caves was shaped by two elements, stone and flame, sharp edges cut, scraped, and shaped, flames warmed, cooked, and illuminated. Together they defined the rhythm of Neanderthal survival. Even as the world beyond changed, as glaciers advanced and modern humans spread, the Neanderthals of Gibraltar maintained their traditions. Their fires burned bright within the stone shelters, and their flakes glimmered under the same hands that had struck them for generations. From the eastern mouth of Gorham's Cave, the horizon stretched across the narrowing strait. On clear days, the mountains of North Africa loomed faintly, their ridges silhouetted against the morning sun. For the Neanderthals living at Gibraltar, those distant peaks were part of the landscape of daily life, visible reminders of another world. Whether they understood what lay across the waters is uncertain. But by the time they were making their last fires on the Iberian coast, another species, Homo sapiens, was spreading widely across that horizon, filling both Africa and Europe with signs of its presence. Modern humans had left Africa tens of thousands of years earlier. By 45,000 years ago, they had reached Europe. Cave paintings in France and Spain, ornaments of ivory and shell, bone tools, and elaborate stone blades mark their expansion. Archaeology shows that sapiens brought with them not only different technologies, but also broader social networks. Items moved across great distances, shell beads found far inland, ochre carried hundreds of kilometers, flint blades traded between groups. These networks linked communities together in ways Neanderthals rarely achieved. By the time Neanderthals retreated to refuges like Gibraltar, modern humans had established themselves in many regions of Europe. The contrast between the two groups is visible in material culture. In the caves of northern Spain and southern France, sapiens painted images of bison, horses, and abstract symbols on stone walls. They carved figurines from mammoth ivory and fashioned needles from bone to sew fitted clothing. None of these practices appear in Neanderthal Gibraltar. Instead, the toolkits there remained Mysterian, flakes, scrapers, and simple points. The Neanderthals endured by continuity, while sapiens advanced by innovation. The two ways of life overlapped in time, but diverged in expression. Yet overlap did occur. Genetic evidence confirms that Neanderthals and sapiens interbred. Between 1 and 2% of the genomes of living non-African humans today derive from Neanderthal ancestry. This means that contact was not only geographic, but biological. Where and how such interactions occurred remains debated. Some likely happened in the Levant, where both species are known to have lived at overlapping times. Others may have occurred in Europe itself. Whether Gibraltar was one of those places is unknown. Archaeological layers there have not yet produced clear evidence of sapiens' presence at the same time as Neanderthals. Still, the possibility cannot be dismissed. On a planetary scale, the spread of sapiens was part of a broader expansion. From Africa they moved into the Middle East, then into Europe, Asia, and eventually across all continents except Antarctica. This expansion was linked to their ability to adapt to diverse environments, tundra, forest, desert, and coast alike. Compared with Neanderthals, who remained concentrated in Eurasia, sapiens displayed a far greater ecological breadth. By the time Gibraltar's Neanderthals were gathering shellfish on rocky shores, sapiens groups were painting caves in France and planning long journeys across Asia. The world was shifting toward their dominance. A lesser-known detail illustrates this contrast. At sites in southern Spain, modern human occupations contain perforated shell beads colored with ochre, used as personal ornaments. These are absent from Neanderthal contexts. The use of such ornaments implies not only symbolic thought but also social signaling, ways of expressing identity and group membership. These networks of meaning connected sapiens groups across wide areas, reinforcing bonds and facilitating cooperation. The Neanderthals of Gibraltar, by contrast, left few traces of such symbolic systems. Their survival depended on immediate, local resources, not long-distance ties. The mystery is whether the two populations ever directly encountered one another in southern Iberia. Some models suggest that modern humans did not reach the far south of Spain until after Neanderthals were already gone. Others propose that there may have been periods of overlap, with groups avoiding one another or interacting sporadically. The archaeological record remains fragmentary. Layers are disturbed, dates debated, contexts incomplete. Without definitive evidence, the question remains unresolved. Did Gibraltar's Neanderthals ever glimpse a sapiens group along the distant shore? Did they ever see strange tools or ornaments carried by others? For now, silence is the answer. Still, the awareness of neighbors across the sea or land must have existed in some form. Humans are attentive to movement, to smoke on the horizon, to unfamiliar sounds. If sapiens groups occupied nearby valleys, the Neanderthals would have known. The absence of direct evidence does not preclude knowledge. It only conceals the details of how such awareness manifested, whether as avoidance, curiosity, or fleeting encounters. From Gibraltar, the contrast of fates was stark. One species was contracting, confined to refugees and relying on continuity. The other was expanding, spreading across continents with innovations and connections. The two lineages shared common ancestry, similar physiques, and many capacities. But the outcomes diverged. In the end, it was sapiens who would inherit the future, while Neanderthals faded into the record of stone and bone. On a planetary scale, this divergence was amplified by climate. During the last glacial maximum, the stresses of shifting vegetation and unstable environments tested all human groups. Sapiens, with wider diets and broader networks, could buffer against scarcity by sharing resources and ideas. Neanderthals, in small, isolated bands, lacked such resilience. Gibraltar's survival strategy, shellfish, birds, rabbits, and fire, was effective locally, but it could not match the scale of adaptation unfolding elsewhere. Yet their endurance was not meaningless. For thousands of years after most of their kin had disappeared, the Gibraltar Neanderthals held on. They represent not failure, but persistence. Their survival in caves at the edge of Europe demonstrates that even as another human lineage spread and thrived, Neanderthals found ways to endure. The story of neighbors across the sea is thus not only about contrast, but also about coexistence in time, two branches of humanity living side by side on a changing planet. Step by step, sapiens advanced through Europe, leaving art, ornaments, and blades. Step by step, Neanderthals retreated to refuges like Gibraltar, leaving hearths, shells, and flakes. Their paths crossed, their genes mingled, their histories intertwined. Across the narrow strait, mountains rose and waves churned, carrying the echoes of both species. For a brief time, the two shared the same world, even if their destinies diverged. When archaeologists sift through layers of cave sediment, they often find overlapping traces, stone flakes from one culture lying just beneath or beside artifacts from another. In southern Europe, such juxtapositions raise questions about whether Neanderthals and Homo sapiens ever truly shared the same landscapes, or whether their occupations were separated by centuries or millennia. The record is complex. In some regions, Neanderthal layers end and sapiens layers begin with only the thinnest gap between them. In others, the two seem interwoven, as if both were present, though not necessarily together, in the same valleys. In Gibraltar, the evidence is more elusive. The caves contain clear Neanderthal signatures, Mousterian flakes, hearths, shellfish remains, but definitive signs of sapiens appear later, often in different contexts. This leaves a puzzle. Did the two populations overlap here, or did modern humans arrive only after the last Neanderthals were gone? The answer remains unsettled. Archaeologists debate whether the apparent absence of overlap reflects reality or simply the incompleteness of excavation. Genetics tells us that overlap did occur somewhere. Genomes of living people outside Africa contain fragments of Neanderthal DNA, proof of interbreeding tens of thousands of years ago. These genetic footprints are scattered across all humans of Eurasian descent. They confirm that Neanderthals and sapiens met, exchanged genes, and left a legacy that persists today. The timing of these encounters varies. Some interbreeding likely took place in the Near East as sapiens moved out of Africa. Other events may have occurred in Europe itself, during the long centuries when both lineages occupied the same continent. Archaeological hints support this genetic evidence. At sites in central France, the Châtelperronian industry shows a mixture of tool types, Mousterian flakes alongside blade tools more typical of sapiens. Some scholars see this as evidence of Neanderthals adopting elements of sapiens technology through contact. Others argue it represents independent innovation, or even intrusion of sapiens artifacts into Neanderthal levels. The debate illustrates the difficulty of reading overlapping footprints. Sediments mix, layers compress, and the passage of time blurs distinctions. In Iberia, similar debates unfold. At caves such as Carihuela and Zafaraya, late Neanderthal remains lie close in time to early sapiens evidence. Some researchers propose that Neanderthals in southern Spain survived longer precisely because the region was a frontier zone where direct competition with sapiens was limited. Others counter that even in the far south, sapiens eventually arrived, and the lack of clear overlap reflects only the patchiness of preservation. Gibraltar, at the continent's edge, sits within this uncertainty. Its caves may have been the last bastion of Neanderthals before sapiens spread through the peninsula. On a planetary scale, such overlaps reflect the broader rhythms of human migration. As sapiens expanded, they encountered earlier populations, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, perhaps others now unknown. Each encounter left traces, sometimes in bones and tools, sometimes only in DNA. The layers of prehistory are thus not neat successions, but mosaics of contact, replacement, and survival. Gibraltar's story belongs to this larger tapestry. It was one of the final places where the question of overlap plays out. A lesser-known detail adds texture to this picture. In Gorham's cave, the engraved crosshatch on bedrock, attributed to Neanderthals, lies in sediments close in date to the earliest modern human art elsewhere in Iberia. This juxtaposition suggests that symbolic expression may have developed in parallel, or perhaps through indirect influence, in both groups. If sapiens were painting animals in northern Spain while Neanderthals were engraving lines in Gibraltar, then overlapping footprints were not only physical but cognitive. The two species may have approached symbolic behavior from different directions at nearly the same time. Mysteries remain about how frequent these encounters were. Did Neanderthals and sapiens meet often, exchanging words or gestures? Or were such meetings rare, fleeting events over centuries? Were they cooperative, hostile, or indifferent? Archaeology cannot yet resolve these questions. The bones and tools left behind are mute. They record presence, not interaction. The genetic evidence shows unions occurred, but not their frequency, context, or meaning. Each piece of data is a footprint, but the paths between them are invisible. Still, the overlapping footprints matter. They remind us that Neanderthals did not vanish into silence overnight. For thousands of years, their presence and that of sapiens coexisted in Europe. The caves of Gibraltar may not yet show direct evidence of contact, but they fit within the broader timeline where such overlap was inevitable. The last Neanderthals lived while sapiens already walked the same continent. Their stories unfolded side by side, even if separated by distance or circumstance. From Gibraltar's cliffs, Neanderthals could see Africa across the sea. a land where sapiens had thrived for tens of thousands of years. Inland, sapiens were gradually moving southward through Iberia. The physical proximity was real, even if archaeological overlap is scarce. The possibility of awareness, seeing distant smoke, hearing faint calls, finding strange footprints, remains. For Neanderthals in their final refuge, the presence of another kind of human may have been a silent fact of life, whether or not they ever shared the same caves. On the scale of human history, these centuries of overlap are brief, yet they shaped the lineage of modern humanity. Through interbreeding, through cultural exchanges or parallels, the Neanderthal legacy entered our species. In DNA sequences, echoes of shared behavior, their footprints overlap with ours even now, Gibraltar's caves, and with their shells, hearths, and engravings. A part of this story, a place where the paths of two human kinds ran close, if not always together. Step by step, footprints pressed into sediment by bare Neanderthal feet overlapped with the lighter impressions of sapiens somewhere in Europe. Step by step, the two species shared landscapes, resources, and perhaps fleeting encounters. In the record of stone and bone, these overlaps remain faint but real. They remind us that the boundary between Neanderthal and sapiens was not absolute, but porous, shaped by time, chance, and proximity. Gibraltar holds part of that boundary, written in its caves and shores. Across the span of the last glacial maximum, climate in Europe was never static. Even during periods of deep cold, conditions oscillated, sometimes within just a few centuries. For the Neanderthals at Gibraltar, these shifts defined the world they lived in. Their survival depended on landscapes that changed slowly in some respects, limestone cliffs, caves, and seas, but shifted rapidly in others, especially vegetation and animal distributions. Forests that had once stretched across valleys diminished, replaced by open scrub and grassland. Rivers fluctuated, wetlands dried, and animals altered their ranges in response. Evidence of these changes lies preserved in natural archives. Pollen grains embedded in cave sediments and lake beds tell of vegetation waxing and waning. In southern Iberia, cores reveal alternating phases. Pine and oak flourishing during milder intervals, then giving way to steppe plants when cold returned. Such cycles were tied to Dansgaard-Oeschger events, abrupt climatic oscillations identified in Greenland ice cores. Within a lifetime, a community could see landscapes transform, forcing them to adapt repeatedly. For Neanderthals, shrinking forests meant scarcity of certain resources. Woodland animals like red deer and wild boar declined when cover disappeared. Firewood became harder to collect as tree stands thinned. Small patches of woodland persisted in sheltered valleys, but access may have been contested by other animals or even by incoming groups of modern humans. To live through such times required flexibility, seeking alternative prey, gathering brush for fires, and turning more often to coastal foods when inland supplies fell short. On a planetary scale, the expansion of ice sheets in the north altered global circulation. Winds carried fine dust southward, spreading it across Europe and beyond. This dust is preserved in loess deposits, silent markers of cold, dry conditions. In Africa, monsoon systems weakened, reducing rainfall and expanding deserts. These distant shifts fed back into Iberia, shaping rainfall patterns and further stressing ecosystems. For Gibraltar's Neanderthals, the changing sky and shifting winds were not abstract global processes but daily realities. Colder air, drier soils, fewer trees, and different migrations of animals. A lesser-known detail emerges from analysis of small animal remains in Gibraltar's caves. Rabbits, common across Iberia, appear in large numbers in some levels. Their abundance may reflect a shift toward smaller, more resilient prey as larger game became scarce. To exploit such animals, Neanderthals may have needed new strategies, trapping, snaring, or communal drives. Though direct evidence of such methods is lacking, the sheer number of rabbit bones suggests systematic exploitation. In the absence of dense forests and abundant deer, small animals helped bridge nutritional gaps. The mystery remains how much these climatic shifts directly influenced Neanderthal decline. Did shrinking forests push them toward extinction, or were they simply one more stress in a broader pattern of vulnerability? Archaeologists debate whether environmental change alone could have driven them to disappear, or whether competition with modern humans sealed their fate. In Gibraltar, the mild coastal refuge seems to have buffered some extremes. Yet even here, climate left its mark. Sediments show alternating phases of occupation and abandonment, perhaps reflecting times when conditions became too harsh or resources too limited. From the vantage of Gorham's cave, Neanderthals could see evidence of these changes. Where once there may have been wooded slopes, scrub now dominated. Herds of red deer thinned, while ibex clung to rocky crags. Birds altered their migration patterns, some arriving in different seasons. The sea, too, responded, with colder waters bringing shifts in fish populations. Each change required adjustments in foraging and hunting. The rhythm of survival was not fixed, but continuously redefined by climate's hand. On longer timescales, these oscillations remind us of the fragility of ecosystems. A few degrees of cooling could transform forests into steppe. A slight reduction in rainfall could dry rivers and lakes. For humans living in small groups, such changes were not background noise, they were existential. The persistence of Gibraltar's Neanderthals into late times may reflect their ability to exploit a mosaic landscape, but it also underscores the narrowness of their survival margin. A few bad years or a prolonged cold phase could have tipped the balance. Archaeologists studying microfauna, small rodents, reptiles, and amphibians add further detail. These creatures are sensitive to environmental shifts. Their remains in Gibraltar's caves show alternating dominance of species preferring open grassland versus those favoring woodland. Such transitions mirror the pollen record and confirm the instability of habitats. For Neanderthals, this meant continual recalibration of knowledge, learning new patterns of animal movement, adapting to different plant growth, adjusting firewood collection to changing availability. Fire, in this context, became even more crucial. With forests shrinking, wood was scarce. Neanderthals relied on brush, shrubs, and driftwood. Hearths in the caves show varied fuel types, reflecting adaptation to what could be gathered. Without abundant timber, fires may have been smaller, maintained carefully, and perhaps guarded against waste. This constant negotiation with a changing environment shaped the daily rhythm of life. From a global perspective, these changes connect Gibraltar to distant ice. The great glaciers in the north advanced and retreated, altering sea level, wind, and rainfall across hemispheres. Neanderthals in Gibraltar, though never seeing those ice sheets, lived within their influence. The contraction of forests and expansion of scrub was one thread in a vast planetary web, linking local survival to global systems. The resilience of these communities is striking. Despite the instability, they endured. They hunted deer when they could, turned to rabbits when necessary, gathered shellfish when inland game failed, and lit fires with whatever fuel the land provided. Over thousands of years, they adjusted to shifting climates, surviving where others had not. Yet resilience has limits. Over time, the compounded stress of shrinking forests, declining prey, and isolation eroded their chances. The overlapping footprints of climate and human fate converge here. Each pollen grain, each rabbit bone, each ash layer tells of adaptation, but also of fragility. Neanderthals were not passive victims of change. They observed, learned, and acted. But their small numbers and limited networks meant that every shift pressed heavily upon them. In Gibraltar, the shrinking forests were not distant trends, but the narrowing of their world. Step by step, as trees retreated and scrub spread, their choices diminished. The fire still burned in Gorham's cave. Tools were still struck from stone, meals still gathered from shore and hillside. But the forest that once sheltered deer and provided fuel grew thinner each generation. The rhythm of climate was relentless, and in its shifting beat lay the challenges that shaped the last chapter of Neanderthal survival. By the time most of Europe had lost its Neanderthal presence, Gibraltar remained one of the last inhabited refuges. Here, at the southern edge of Iberia, a small community held on. They were not many, perhaps only a few dozen individuals at most. Archaeologists cannot know the exact number, but genetic and demographic studies suggest that Neanderthal populations across late Europe had already dwindled to critically low levels. In Gibraltar, survival depended on the resilience of one small band, enduring within the shelter of caves and the resources of a narrow landscape. The evidence for this diminished scale is indirect, yet compelling. The toolkits found in Gorham's and Vanguard caves are repetitive, their forms consistent across layers. Such homogeneity suggests a limited community, one where knowledge circulated among only a few nappers. The absence of innovation, compared with the diversity of Homo sapiens artifacts elsewhere, may reflect the demographic isolation of this group. Cultural transmission thrives in large, connected populations. In tiny communities, skills may persist, but opportunities for experimentation are few. Animal remains further hint at small group sizes in the quantities of bones recovered. Deer, ibex, rabbits, birds suggest modest consumption rates. Hearths are present but not abundant, as if fires were maintained by only a handful of people at a time. The caves show repeated use, but not the dense accumulation that would mark large or continuous populations. These traces speak of small groups returning seasonally or residing for limited periods, sustaining themselves with what the land and sea provided. Living as a small band had profound consequences. Social dynamics in such groups were fragile. With fewer individuals, genetic diversity declined, raising risks of inbreeding. Each death, whether from accident, illness, or conflict, carried heavier weight. A hunter lost to injury meant not only grief, but also a reduction in the group's ability to provide food. A skilled flint knapper's absence could leave a gap in essential knowledge. In such communities, survival was a collective effort, yet always precarious. On a planetary scale, this smallness contrasts sharply with the expanding presence of Homo sapiens. While Neanderthals contracted to refugees, sapiens spread across continents, establishing wide-ranging networks and exchanging ideas over long distances. For Gibraltar's Neanderthals, the world was shrinking. For sapiens, it was expanding. The fate of a small band at Europe's edge was thus tied to the larger rhythms of human history, a lineage fading as another rose. A lesser-known detail from Gibraltar highlights the persistence of this group. In Vanguard Cave, excavations revealed evidence of repeated fire use and consumption of marine resources well into late times. The continuity of occupation suggests that even in diminished numbers, the Neanderthals maintained routines of life, gathering shellfish at low tide, hunting rabbits in scrub, lighting hearths in sheltered spaces. This endurance shows remarkable resilience. Despite their small size, the band adapted to shifting conditions and survived where others had not. Yet mystery surrounds the social fabric of such a group. How did they organize themselves? Did they consist of extended families or of unrelated individuals bound by necessity? With so few people, how were roles divided? Hunters, gatherers, caretakers of young? Archaeology provides no direct answers. The bones and tools are silent about kinship and cooperation. But demographic modeling suggests that Neanderthal groups may have been more fluid than once thought, with occasional movement between bands to exchange mates and knowledge. For Gibraltar's survivors, isolation may have curtailed even these possibilities, leaving them more vulnerable. The rhythm of daily life for a small band can be inferred from the remains. In the morning, some members might walk the rocky shoreline, prying limpets from stone and collecting seaweed or driftwood. Others would ascend the slopes in search of rabbits or deer, watching for signs of ibex on the crags. At midday, fires burned in the caves, shells roasted, meat cooked, and hides scraped. In the evening, smoke drifted from cave mouths, and the group gathered close to warmth as the cold winds of the Ice Age swept outside. The scale of these activities was modest, reflecting the capacity of only a few dozen people. Yet it was enough to persist. On a larger ecological canvas, the endurance of this band illustrates the potential of refugees. Just as plants and animals survive in sheltered pockets during harsh climates, so too did humans. Gibraltar's limestone caves, mild climate, and diverse resources provided a niche where a small group could hold on while others vanished. This ecological principle, refugia, sustaining remnants during adverse times, applies across species. The Neanderthals of Gibraltar were one such remnant, enduring within their niche as glacial forces reshaped the planet. Still, endurance has limits. A small band cannot withstand indefinite isolation. Genetic drift, loss of knowledge, and vulnerability to sudden disasters accumulate over time. A failed hunt, a storm that destroys a key resource, an epidemic of illness. Any of these could push a fragile group past recovery. The archaeological record cannot pinpoint which stresses finally ended the Gibraltar Neanderthals, but the smallness of their community magnified every risk. Their persistence into late times is remarkable, but their eventual disappearance was almost inevitable. From a planetary perspective, the story of this small band invites reflection on the scale of human survival. While sapiens' populations expanded by tens of thousands, exploring continents and creating art, the Neanderthals of Gibraltar endured as only dozens. Yet in their fires and tools, they carried forward traditions that had lasted for hundreds of millennia. Their smallness does not diminish their humanity. It emphasizes instead the precariousness of existence and the resilience required to persist against odds. A final reflection comes from the sediment layers themselves. Archaeologists digging through Gorham's Cave find thin bands of ash, stone flakes, and bones. Each band represents the presence of a few people, sitting by firelight, shaping flint, cooking meals. Layer upon layer accumulates, marking centuries of return. For the Neanderthals of Gibraltar, these acts were ordinary. For us, They are extraordinary traces of endurance. A small band, living at the edge of their world, kept the flame of their lineage alive until the very end. Step by step, tide by tide, they continued. Their footprints pressed into sand, their smoke drifted against cliffs, their tools glinted in firelight. Though small in number, they endured. And in that endurance, they wrote the last chapter of Neanderthal life in Europe. Along the coast beneath Gibraltar's cliffs, the tide still ebbed and flowed as it always had. Limpets clung to rocks, birds circled in the wind, and the sea spread in endless rhythm. But for the Neanderthals living here in their final generations, the shores were not as plentiful as before. Archaeological layers in Gorham's and Vanguard caves show subtle but telling changes. Shells grow fewer, seal bones diminish, and traces of large game become rarer with time. These fragments tell a story of dwindling opportunities, of a world where the hunts grew harder and the shores less generous. At earlier stages, Neanderthals of Gibraltar had relied on a diverse menu. Shellfish, rabbits, ibex, and deer each contributed to survival. Seal bones appear in some levels, suggesting opportunistic hunting or scavenging along the shore. Yet as millennia passed, the record shows a decline. Shell middens thin, bird bones become less frequent, and signs of large mammals nearly disappear. This does not mean the animals vanished altogether. More likely, their availability decreased, or Neanderthal capacity to exploit them waned as their population shrank. A few dozen individuals could only maintain so many hunts, and each failed effort carried greater cost. Fireplaces in the caves reflect this shift. In earlier layers, they are abundant, with dense accumulations of burned bone. In later strata, hearths are fewer, and burned remains less varied. Such changes imply reduced intensity of occupation or fewer resources to burn. Ash still appears, showing that fires continued, but the richness of earlier times fades. The caves remain inhabited, yet the activity within them grows quieter. On a planetary scale, these changes coincide with broader environmental stresses. The last glacial maximum reduced forest cover and shifted rainfall patterns. Inland ecosystems grew harsher, pushing deer and other prey into more limited ranges. Coastal productivity also fluctuated with sea temperatures and currents. Cold waters sometimes brought abundance, but instability could reduce fish and marine mammals. The Neanderthals of Gibraltar lived within these shifts, their survival tied to forces far beyond their control. As glaciers advanced and winds changed, the shores they had depended on for centuries became less reliable. A lesser-known detail comes from studies of fish bones found in some cave layers. In earlier levels, small fish species are present, indicating occasional catches or scavenging. In later levels, these bones are absent. This absence may reflect reduced fishing attempts, or it may signal ecological change in nearshore waters. Either way, it is another fragment in the mosaic of decline, a subtle marker of opportunities narrowing. The mystery is whether these changes reflect environmental depletion, human overuse, or simple demographic collapse. Did dwindling populations mean fewer hunters to catch seals and deer? Did rising competition with incoming sapiens cut off access to key resources? Or did the ecosystems themselves change, reducing abundance regardless of human action? Archaeologists cannot separate these factors completely. What is visible is the cumulative effect: fewer bones, fewer shells, quieter hearths. The image of vanishing hunts is sharpened by comparisons with earlier Neanderthal life. Across Europe, their history was one of skilled hunting of large mammals. At sites in Germany and France, remains of mammoths, bison, and rhinoceroses show their ability to coordinate complex hunts. At Gibraltar, by contrast, the final record contains none of these great kills. The ecology of southern Iberia offered fewer such giants, but the absence also marks the shrinking scale of Neanderthal subsistence. From mammoths and bison to rabbits and limpets, the trajectory was one of contraction. Yet even in this diminished world, endurance continued. The caves show that Neanderthals still lit fires, still struck flakes of flint, still consumed meals by firelight. Their survival strategies narrowed, but did not disappear. Gathering shellfish may have replaced hunting deer, but it was still a viable means of life. A few hands collecting limpets at low tide could feed a small group. Even if the abundance was less than before, persistence was possible, though precarious. On a larger ecological canvas, such persistence resembles other species confined to refuges. Plants retreat to valleys. Animals find niches in sheltered forests. Birds survive in coastal sanctuaries. The Neanderthals of Gibraltar were part of this pattern. Their refuge buffered them against extinction for thousands of years. But unlike plants and animals, their survival required not only habitat but also social cohesion. As numbers dwindled, the silence of shores and the difficulty of hunts were amplified by demographic fragility. Archaeologists note that the later layers in Gibraltar's caves contain more evidence of small animals, rabbits, birds, than large ones. This reliance on smaller prey may reflect adaptation, but it also marks limitation. Smaller animals yield less food per effort, requiring more frequent foraging. For a small band, the labor of constant hunting and gathering could have been taxing. Each day demanded new effort, with little surplus for emergencies. This constant precariousness is written in the bones and shells left behind. The silence of the shores is thus not only environmental, but cultural. The grand hunts of earlier Neanderthal times, with coordinated strategies against massive prey, gave way to quiet foraging. Fires burned smaller. Bones cracked less frequently. The caves echoed with fewer voices. For archaeologists, the thinning of debris is a powerful measure of this fading. It is not absence, but attenuation. The record grows sparse, not empty. The Neanderthals still lived, but their presence was reduced to whispers in the sediment. On a planetary scale, their decline coincided with the ascent of sapiens. As Neanderthal hunts grew fewer, sapiens communities flourished across Europe, painting caves, shaping bone tools, and expanding diets. The contrast highlights the divergent fates of two human lineages. For one, opportunities multiplied. For the other, they dwindled. Gibraltar's silent shores symbolize this divergence, a microcosm of global change, where resilience reached its limits. Still, endurance itself must be acknowledged. Even with vanishing hunts, even with shrinking resources, Gibraltar's Neanderthals survived thousands of years longer than their kin elsewhere. Their ability to persist with little, to adapt to scarcity, extended their story into late prehistory. Though their world was quieter, it was not yet ended. Each shell gathered, each rabbit caught, each fire lit represented resistance against final disappearance. Step by step, the Neanderthals of Gibraltar moved between cave and shore, seeking what remained. Their hunts grew fewer, their harvests smaller, but they endured. In the thinning record of bones and shells, we glimpse their resilience and their fragility. Silent shores, vanishing hunts. These were the conditions of their last generations, the shadows before their final absence. Deep inside Gorham's cave, the sediments hold one of the most poignant records of human prehistory, the traces of the final fires ever lit by Neanderthals. Layer upon layer of ash, charcoal, and burned bone lies compressed beneath the cave floor. Each hearth is a snapshot of presence, of people gathering in darkness, feeding flames, cooking meals, taken together. They mark the persistence of Neanderthal life in Gibraltar long after their kind had vanished elsewhere. But in the later levels, the hearths become fewer, their contents thinner, until they fade entirely. These are the last hearths, the last fires of a lineage nearing its end. Archaeologists excavating Gorham's sediments identify hearths by subtle signs. Ash turns sediment grey and powdery. Charcoal fragments remain as black flecks. Burned bones crack and whiten, their surfaces altered by heat. Some hearths are small, no larger than a dinner plate, while others spread wider, showing repeated use. In certain layers, clusters of hearths appear, suggesting that fires were lit again and again in the same spots. In later layers, however, hearths are sparse, with long stretches of sterile sand between them. This decline mirrors the dwindling of Neanderthal presence across the peninsula. For the Neanderthals who lived here, fire was indispensable. It provided warmth in cold glacial nights, cooked shellfish and rabbit meat, dried hides, and warded off dampness from the sea air. Fire extended usable hours of the day, turning the cave into a livable space rather than a hollow of stone. Without fire, survival in the Ice Age world would have been almost impossible. The persistence of hearths into the late layers of Gorham's cave shows that these Neanderthals retained mastery of flame until the very end. A lesser-known detail adds depth to this story. Microscopic analysis of some ash layers reveals traces of seaweed and grasses. This suggests that Neanderthals may have used multiple types of fuel, not only wood. Driftwood from beaches, shrubs from scrubland, and even dried seaweed could feed a fire. Such flexibility reflects adaptation to scarcity. With forests shrinking and wood becoming limited, these late Neanderthals employed whatever materials they could gather. Their last hearths thus record ingenuity as well as persistence. On a planetary scale, the last hearths connect to the great cycles of fire in human history. The control of flame, achieved hundreds of thousands of years earlier, was one of humanity's defining achievements. Fire allowed expansion into cold climates, protection from predators, and the development of cooking. For sapiens, fire also became central to ritual and symbolism. For Neanderthals at Gibraltar, it remained primarily practical, yet no less vital. Their final fires were part of a lineage of flame stretching across continents and millennia. Mysteries remain about the social context of these last hearths. Were they lit by families, by small groups of survivors, or by individuals alone? Archaeology cannot say. The ash and charcoal reveal only that fire burned here, not who tended it. Some layers show multiple hearths close together, suggesting a group gathered in the cave. Others contain isolated patches of ash, perhaps the work of only a few people. In the absence of direct evidence, we can only recognize the silence of the record. The hearths glow, but the people remain unseen. The symbolism of the last hearths resonates deeply. In human cultures across the world, fire has long represented life and continuity. A hearth is the heart of a dwelling, the place where warmth and sustenance center. For the Neanderthals of Gibraltar, the last hearths were literally the final centers of their existence. When those fires went out, their presence ended. The caves that had once echoed with voices and smoke fell silent. The hearths buried beneath drifting sand. Comparisons with other sites highlight the uniqueness of Gibraltar. In France, Germany, and Central Europe, Neanderthal hearths disappear around 40,000 years ago, replaced by those of sapiens. In Gibraltar, hearths continue into the late 24th millennium before present, long after the rest of the continent had changed. This longevity underscores Gibraltar's role as a refuge, a place where traditions endured. The last hearths in Gorham's cave may therefore represent the very final fires of Neanderthal humanity anywhere on Earth. From a practical perspective, the construction of hearths in these caves shows consistency. Stones were sometimes arranged to contain embers. Ash was raked aside to clear space for new fires. Bones cracked and burned when thrown onto flames. The daily rhythm of tending fire, feeding it with wood and brush, was repeated countless times. Each action was ordinary in the moment, yet extraordinary in hindsight, for these were the final repetitions of a practice carried by Neanderthals for hundreds of thousands of years. The decline of hearths parallels the decline of hunts and foraging. As game became scarce and shellfish less abundant, the number of fires shrank. Perhaps fewer meals were cooked, or fewer people were present to cook them. The silence of the caves deepened as hearths disappeared. In the sediment record, this thinning is stark, once rich layers of ash giving way to sterile sand, as if the rhythm of life slowed and stopped. The last hearths are therefore not only archaeological features but symbols of disappearance. On a larger ecological canvas, the extinction of hearths mirrors the fragility of small populations in marginal habitats. When numbers fall, cultural practices can vanish quickly. A small band may maintain fire use, but if knowledge is not passed on, or if there are too few people to sustain routines, traditions can falter. At Gibraltar, fire persisted until the end. But the dwindling of hearths suggests that fewer and fewer people carried this knowledge forward. Eventually, the lineage ended, and no one remained to light a flame. Yet, in acknowledging this ending, we also recognize resilience. For thousands of years after their kin had disappeared elsewhere, the Neanderthals of Gibraltar continued to light fires in Gorham's cave. Each hearth represents resistance against extinction, persistence in the face of decline. The ashes that remain are testaments to survival, not merely to loss. They show that until the very end, Neanderthals remained human in their daily practices, shaping stone, gathering food, and tending fire. Step by step, generation by generation, the last hearths were lit. Flames flickered against limestone walls. Smoke curled upward. Embers glowed in the dark. Around them, meals were shared. Hides dried. Tools repaired. Then, slowly, the hearths became fewer, the fires smaller, the ashes thinner. Finally, the flames went out. The caves returned to silence, and the hearths were buried by time. What remains today are thin layers of ash, quiet reminders of the final fires of Neanderthal life. By 24,000 years ago, the Neanderthals of Gibraltar were gone. Their hearths no longer glowed in the caves, their footprints no longer pressed into sand, and their voices no longer echoed against limestone walls. Unlike the great extinctions of animals that leave behind mass bone beds, The end of the Neanderthals at Gibraltar is marked by absence rather than abundance. Archaeologists excavate layers of sand and find silence, the sudden lack of ash, tools, and bones. Their disappearance left no witness, no chronicler, no survivor to record the final moment. The end of the Gibraltar Neanderthals is among the most enigmatic episodes in human history. We can describe their persistence into late times. We can trace their adaptations to shellfish, birds, rabbits, and fire. We can see their continuity of Mousterian tools, yet we cannot pinpoint how, or exactly when, their last generation came to an end. Did they fade gradually, their numbers dwindling until only a few individuals remained, too few to sustain reproduction? Or was there a sudden event, disease, accident, or conflict that extinguished the last flame? Archaeology offers fragments, but no complete answer. One possibility is demographic collapse. Small populations face severe risks of inbreeding, loss of knowledge, and vulnerability to chance. In Gibraltar, the Neanderthal band may have been reduced to only a few dozen individuals. If their numbers dipped below the threshold needed to maintain a viable population, extinction could have followed inevitably. Children may have been born with fewer and fewer companions of their age. Skills may have been lost if elders died before passing them on. Step by step, generation by generation, the population may simply have dwindled out. Another possibility is environmental change. The last glacial maximum imposed harsh conditions across Europe. Though Gibraltar was a mild refuge compared with the frozen north, it was not immune. Shifting climates reduced forest cover, altered rainfall, and reshaped coastal ecosystems. If shellfish beds declined, or if prey animals grew too scarce, survival may have become untenable. The archaeological record shows declines in animal remains and hearths in the final layers. These declines may reflect ecological stress that eventually overcame the last band. On a planetary scale, the disappearance of Neanderthals coincided with the spread of Homo sapiens. By 24,000 years ago, modern humans occupied Iberia, leaving behind caves with paintings, ornaments, and blade tools. Whether sapiens directly replaced Neanderthals in Gibraltar is uncertain. The archaeological layers do not clearly show overlap, yet the timing invites speculation. Did sapiens enter Gibraltar after the Neanderthals were gone, or did their arrival accelerate the end? Without witnesses, the sequence remains unclear. A lesser-known detail adds to this uncertainty. Radiocarbon dating of the final Neanderthal layers in Gorham's Cave shows occupations as late as 24,000 years ago. Yet some scholars argue that contamination or later disturbance may skew these results. If so, the last Neanderthals may have disappeared earlier. The debate highlights the fragility of evidence at the edge of deep time. A single date can shift interpretations by thousands of years. Thus, even the precise moment of disappearance remains unresolved. The mystery of their end resonates because it lacks finality. Other species leave clear signs of extinction, bones scattered in abundance, environments transformed. The Neanderthals of Gibraltar left only absence. One season, they were present, lighting fires, gathering shellfish, hunting rabbits. The next, they were gone. The caves filled with sand blown from nearby beaches. Birds nested where hearths had once burned. Waves continued to crash against the cliffs, indifferent to the loss. No witness marked the moment, no memory preserved the story. Yet the silence itself is instructive. It reminds us of the fragility of human presence. cultures and lineages can vanish without ceremony, leaving only faint traces in sediment. The disappearance of Gibraltar's Neanderthals underscores that survival is never guaranteed. Even skilled, adaptable humans, with fire and tools, can fade when circumstances converge against them. Their extinction was not dramatic, but quiet, a whisper of absence in caves that once held life. From a planetary perspective, their disappearance marks the end of a lineage that had endured for hundreds of thousands of years. Neanderthals survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and shifting ecosystems. They thrived across Europe and Western Asia, from forests to steppes, from mountains to coasts. To vanish after such resilience shows the profound impact of demographic fragility and competition. Their end is part of the wider story of human evolution, where some lineages endured and others faded. Still, their disappearance without witness does not mean their legacy vanished. In the DNA of modern humans, fragments of Neanderthal genomes persist. In our immune systems, in aspects of our physiology, traces of their inheritance live on. The Gibraltar Neanderthals left no direct descendants, but their lineage flows through us nonetheless. Their extinction was biological in one sense, but not absolute in another. They remain part of humanity's shared story. Archaeologists walking through Gorham's cave today can see the contrast. Deeper layers contain ash, tools, bones. Higher layers, closer to the surface, are sterile sand, blown in by wind after the Neanderthals were gone. The shift is abrupt and stark, the silence of absence laid down in stone. In that silence, we confront the limits of our knowledge. We know they disappeared. We do not know exactly how. Their final moments are lost, erased by time, unrecorded by memory. Yet perhaps that very absence is fitting. The Neanderthals of Gibraltar lived without writing, without monuments, without durable symbols beyond carved lines and stone flakes. Their lives were written in daily acts of survival, fire, food, shelter. Their disappearance without witness is consistent with the quiet endurance that defined them. No drama, no spectacle, only the fading of hearths and the filling of caves with sand. Their end was as unrecorded as their beginnings, absorbed into the long rhythms of earth. Step by step, their presence thinned, fewer hearths, fewer shells, fewer bones, then none. The last ember cooled, the last footprint washed away by tide or wind. No one saw it, no one told it, yet it happened. The Neanderthals of Gibraltar disappeared without witness, leaving behind only the silence of stone and the enduring questions of those who came long after. When the last Neanderthals of Gibraltar were gone, their caves did not collapse or vanish. They remained as they had for millennia, hollow chambers of limestone opening toward the sea. But the traces of human life that had once filled them slowly faded. Without fire, the walls no longer darkened with smoke. Without footsteps, the sandy floors lay undisturbed. Wind carried grains of sand into the entrances, layering over hearths and stone flakes. Birds nested in the crevices. Bats clung to the ceilings, and waves crashed against the cliffs as they always had. The caves became silent once more, occupied only by wind and water. Archaeologists recognize this silence in the stratigraphy. Above the last Neanderthal layers, there are deposits of sterile sand, sediment blown in by coastal winds after human presence ceased. These layers lack ash, bones, and tools. Instead, They contain shells left by gulls, droppings of bats, and traces of natural processes. The contrast with earlier layers is stark. Where once there was evidence of fire and food, there is now only absence. The empty caves record not only the end of a population, but the return of natural processes that continue long after human presence disappears. On a planetary scale, such transitions are common. Habitats once occupied by humans or animals can lie dormant for thousands of years before being reoccupied. Glacial and interglacial cycles create rhythms of presence and absence across landscapes. For Gibraltar, the disappearance of Neanderthals marked one such turning. The caves had been homes. Then they were empty, waiting until later millennia when other humans would return. The rock itself endured, timeless compared with the brief lives that came and went within its hollows. A lesser-known detail illustrates how quickly natural forces reclaimed these spaces. In Gorham's cave, thin layers of wind-blown sand sealed over hearths within decades or centuries after they were abandoned. This rapid covering preserved the ashes in place, but also erased visible traces on the surface. To any observer shortly after the Neanderthals were gone, the cave would have appeared barren, with no hint of the lives once lived there. The emptiness we recognize today was already apparent to the first seabirds and foxes that entered. The mystery of these empty caves is not simply why the Neanderthals disappeared, but why no immediate successors took their place. Modern humans were present in Iberia by this time, yet there is little evidence of them occupying Gibraltar's caves immediately after the Neanderthals left. Was the area abandoned for centuries, perhaps due to shifting coastlines or resource scarcity? Did sapiens pass by, unaware of the shelters waiting on the rock? The archaeological gap raises questions about how human groups used landscapes in the deep past, and why some spaces remained empty even when habitable. From the perspective of Neanderthal history, the empty caves represent finality. Their lineage had survived here for thousands of years, returning again and again to the same shelters. Generations lit fires in the same spots, cooked meals on the same hearths, and knapped tools from the same flint. When the caves fell silent, that cycle ended. For the first time in hundreds of millennia, no Neanderthal lived anywhere on Earth. The Rock of Gibraltar held their last refuge, and its emptiness testified to their extinction. On a human timescale, the silence stretched unimaginably long. For thousands of years, the caves remained uninhabited by people. Sand and silt accumulated, stalactites lengthened by millimeters, and birds nested in hollows. The sea rose and fell with glacial cycles, reshaping coastlines. All the while, the caves endured without voices, smoke, or stone flakes. This deep silence is hard for us to imagine, but it is written in the sterile layers above the last occupations. The emptiness was real, stretching across centuries and millennia. Yet emptiness does not mean erasure. The caves preserved the traces of their former inhabitants beneath protective layers of sand. Hearths, tools, bones, and engravings remained hidden, waiting for discovery tens of thousands of years later. In this way, the empty caves carried memory within silence. They became archives rather than dwellings, preserving history by absence. Without continued use, the evidence of the Neanderthals was not destroyed, but sealed. Their disappearance was final in life, but enduring in the geological record. On a planetary scale, Gibraltar's empty caves are one of many archives of human absence. Across the world, Sites once used by early humans were abandoned and left to silence. Some were reoccupied centuries later, others never again. The pattern reflects both the mobility of human groups and the fragility of survival. The caves of Gibraltar are distinctive only because they mark the last chapter of Neanderthal existence. Their emptiness is not unique, but its meaning is profound. A reflection arises from this silence. The Neanderthals of Gibraltar disappeared without witness. Their caves became empty without ceremony. Yet today, these same spaces are recognized as world heritage, studied with care, and valued as links to deep human history. The emptiness that once marked extinction has become fullness of meaning for us. In this way, the caves have shifted roles from homes into empty hollows, to archives, to monuments of memory. Each stage reflects the passage of time and the way landscapes carry human stories long after humans themselves are gone. Step by step, the silence spread, the last fires cooled, the last shells cracked, the last tools dulled, sand drifted in, covering evidence. Birds called in the distance, waves echoed in the cave mouths, but no human voices returned. The caves became empty, their walls bearing faint stains of smoke, their floors holding buried memory. For thousands of years they waited, hollow and still, until the day when new humans entered, not to live, but to uncover and study. The emptiness of the caves is thus both an ending and a beginning, the quiet pause between life and rediscovery. When all else is gone, voices, memories, lives themselves, what remains are the durable traces left in earth and rock. For the Neanderthals of Gibraltar, those traces are sparse yet powerful. Stone flakes, bone fragments, ashes, shells, and engravings survive as the only witnesses of their existence. Through them, archaeologists reconstruct lives otherwise invisible. In Gorham's Cave, Vanguard Cave, and their neighboring shelters, the remnants of stone and bone tell the story of the last Neanderthals on Earth. The most common evidence is lithic. Hundreds of flakes and tools lie scattered through the cave sediments. These were struck from flint or quartzite nodules, shaped into scrapers, notched implements, and cutting edges. Each flake bears the marks of force, struck by practiced hands against stone cores. The Mousterian tradition, to which they belong, spanned continents and millennia. At Gibraltar, its endurance shows the persistence of knowledge across generations. Even as their population dwindled, Neanderthals continued to make and use tools as their ancestors had done. Stone remains when flesh and wood decay, allowing us to glimpse daily practice across tens of thousands of years. Bones add another dimension. In the caves of Gibraltar, archaeologists recover fragments of red deer, ibex, rabbits, birds, and seals. Cut marks incised by sharp flakes show butchering. Burn marks testify to cooking. Cracked shafts reveal marrow extraction. Each fragment is a record of a meal, a decision, a strategy of survival. Together they show diversity. Neanderthals here did not rely solely on one animal, but drew sustenance from many. The bones also show decline. In later levels, large game becomes rare, replaced by smaller animals and shellfish. In this shift, we see adaptation to scarcity, endurance under pressure. Charcoal and ash layers preserve yet another record. Microscopic analysis of wood fragments identifies species burned in hearths: pine, juniper, oak. The choice of fuel reflects vegetation shifts around Gibraltar. These traces confirm that fire was tended consistently, right to the end. Each thin band of ash marks a hearth. Each hearth marks people gathered together. Though the flames are long extinguished, their residue remains in sediment, a silent register of human presence. A lesser-known but evocative trace lies in engravings. In Gorham's cave, a cross-hatched pattern carved into bedrock may represent deliberate marking by Neanderthals. Its meaning is uncertain. Was it symbolic expression, an idle gesture, or practice in cutting stone? Regardless, it remains as one of the very few examples of Neanderthal abstract marking. It shows that their legacy is not only subsistence, but also thought. Even in their last refuge, they left lines on stone that speak across time. On a planetary scale, the remains in Gibraltar's caves connect to the wider archaeological record of humanity. From Africa to Asia, from Australia to the Americas, human history is reconstructed from durable traces, stone, bone, and fire. In this sense, the Gibraltar Neanderthals are part of a larger pattern of survival and memory. Their remnants echo those of other peoples across the globe, fragments pieced together to form stories of adaptation and change. The difference here is finality. These remains belong to a lineage that ended, leaving no living continuation except through traces in our DNA. Mysteries remain in these remnants. The stone flakes tell us how tools were made, but not how often they were used or how knowledge was shared. The bones tell us what was eaten, but not how hunts were organized. The ash tells us fire burned, but not what stories were told around it. Archaeology gives fragments, not fullness. What remains in stone and bone is durable, but partial. Much of Neanderthal life, song, gesture, thought, kinship, is lost. We can only infer from what endures. Yet these fragments are enough to recognize humanity. The care in knapping flint, the skill in butchering animals, the persistence of fire, the engraving of lines all reveal minds and hands like ours. They show continuity with the wider human story. Though the Neanderthals of Gibraltar vanished without witness, their remnants preserve their humanity. In stone and bone, they endure beyond extinction. On a larger ecological canvas, what remains also tells of relationships with landscapes. Shells in the caves speak of shorelines once walked. Charcoal identifies trees once gathered. Bones mark the presence of herds and flocks that moved across Iberia. Each fragment ties humans to environment, showing the reciprocity of survival. Neanderthals shaped their world by fire and tool, and in turn were shaped by the resources and limits of their refuge. Their remains are not isolated artifacts, but parts of an ecological web recorded in sediment. A subtle but important aspect of these remains is their rarity. Compared with the vast expanses of Neanderthal range across Eurasia, Gibraltar's traces are few, yet their very scarcity makes them precious. They are the final words in a long story, the closing lines written in ash and flint, the last hearths, the last tools, the last meals are all preserved here. They represent not only the persistence of a small group, but the end of an entire lineage. In their durability lies the paradox of absence and presence. People are gone, but their traces remain. The caves themselves act as custodians. Their sheltered interiors protected fragile remnants from wind and rain. Sand sealed them, preserving layers intact. Without such preservation, the memory of Gibraltar's Neanderthals might have vanished completely. Instead, what remains in stone and bone allows us to reconstruct, however incompletely, their final chapter. The caves thus serve as both tomb and archive, holding the last record of a vanished humanity. Step by step, archaeologists uncover these remains, piecing together stories from fragments. A flake of flint reveals a knapper's strike. A burned bone reveals a meal shared. A line carved in stone reveals a moment of thought. Each find is small, yet together they build a narrative of persistence, adaptation, and final disappearance. For us, what remains in stone and bone is enough to glimpse the humanity of those who lived here, and to acknowledge their place in our shared past. Though the Neanderthals of Gibraltar disappeared 24,000 years ago, their remains speak still. They remind us that humanity is fragile, survival never guaranteed, and memory dependent on what endures. In stone and bone, in ash and engraving, they left their last testimony. It is silent, partial, and enigmatic, but it is also enduring. The empty caves hold their absence, but the remains within hold their presence. Through them, the last Neanderthals continue to be part of the human story. The story of Gibraltar's Neanderthals closes not with spectacle, but with stillness. Their fires dimmed, their tools lay scattered, their bones settled into sand. Above them, the sea continued its rhythm, waves breaking endlessly against limestone cliffs. The caves that had sheltered them for millennia stood silent, filling slowly with wind-blown grains and nesting birds. What endures is fragmentary, stone flakes struck by practiced hands, shells cracked for their meat, ashes layered thin between sediments. These remnants tell us of presence, yet also of absence. They show that Neanderthals endured longer here than anywhere else on Earth, holding on for thousands of years while their kin had vanished elsewhere. But they cannot tell us how the final moment came, or what the last firelight revealed. In the genomes of living people, fragments of their inheritance persist. In the limestone of Gibraltar, hearths remain as silent witnesses. The Neanderthals are gone, yet not entirely lost. They endure in memory, in science, and in the enduring rhythm of humanity's shared past. The empty caves remind us that every lineage is fragile, every survival contingent. What was once daily life becomes archaeology, then history, then silence. At Gibraltar, the silence is profound. It is the silence of extinction, but also the silence of continuity for the human story carried on elsewhere. As the waves strike the rock today, they echo against chambers that once held the last of another kind of human. Their story remains incomplete, but enough is known to honor them, resilient, resourceful, enduring to the very edge of time.